They came home to a country that didn't want them. Men who had stormed beaches under machine gun fire, who had seen friends torn apart by artillery, who had looked into the eyes of death and walked forward anyway. They wore the uniform of the United States Army, carried discharge papers that proved their service, and believed foolishly, desperately, that things might be different now. That the blood they had shed on foreign soil might have purchased something more than a ticket back to segregation. They were wrong. And on a humid night in February 1946, in a small town in South Carolina called Batesburg, the hatred that had been waiting for them finally showed its face. But what happened that night, and in the days that followed, would expose a truth so ugly that even a nation exhausted by war could not look away. The bus station in Augusta, Georgia was crowded that evening. Soldiers were everywhere, some still in uniform, others in civilian clothes that hung loose on frames thinned by combat rations and stress. The war had been over for months, but the machinery of demobilization ground slowly, and men who had fought from Normandy to the Rhine, from North Africa to the Philippines, were still finding their way home. Among them was Sergeant Isaac Woodard, a decorated soldier who had served for 3 years in the Pacific Theater. He had loaded ammunition under Japanese air raids in New Guinea, had survived tropical diseases that killed men as surely as bullets, had earned his stripes through competence and courage. At 27 years old, he was lean and quiet, with the careful economy of movement that came from military discipline. He wore his uniform with pride because it was the only thing in America that suggested he was equal to any other man. He had no way of knowing that in a few hours that uniform would not protect him. Nothing would. The Greyhound bus that pulled out of Augusta that night was divided, as all buses in the South were divided, by an invisible line that was enforced with the weight of law and custom and violence. White passengers sat in the front. Black passengers sat in the back. This was not merely tradition, it was the architecture of an entire social order, built on the premise that black Americans were fundamentally inferior, that proximity to them was contaminating, that they must be kept in their place through any means necessary. Sergeant Woodard took his seat in the rear of the bus without complaint. He had grown up in this world. He knew its rules, but the war had changed something in him, as it had changed something in thousands of black soldiers who had worn their country's uniform and seen how other nations treated their black citizens with surprise, with indifference, with humanity. They had tasted something different, and it was impossible to forget. An hour into the journey, Woodard asked the bus driver if they could make a rest stop. It was a simple request, made politely. But the driver, a white man named Alton Blackwell, took offense. In his world, a black man in the back of the bus did not make requests. He waited, he accepted what was given. The exchange grew heated. Witnesses would later disagree on who said what, but the outcome was never in doubt. At the next town, Batesburg, South Carolina, the driver stopped the bus and summoned the police. When Police Chief Linwood Shule arrived, Woodard was still seated. He had done nothing illegal. He had raised his voice, perhaps. He had failed to be sufficiently deferential. In the South in 1946, that was enough. What happened next was not an aberration. It was not the action of one bad man in one bad town. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Chief Shule dragged Woodard off the bus. He beat him in the street with his fists. When Woodard tried to defend himself, a reflexive action, the response of a man trained to fight, Shule beat him harder. Then he arrested him for disorderly conduct and took him to the town jail. And there, in a cell that smelled of urine and fear, Linwood Shule took his nightstick and drove it into Isaac Woodard's eyes. Again and again and again, the sound of wood on bone. The screaming that eventually stopped. When the doctor finally came the next morning, Woodard was blind. Permanently, irreversibly blind. The damage was so severe that his eyeballs had ruptured. He would never see again. He was 27 years old. He had survived the war, but he had not survived coming home. The story might have ended there. In 1946, such incidents rarely made the news. A black man beaten by police was not news, it was Tuesday. The system that allowed such things was vast and indifferent, protected by sheriffs who looked the other way, prosecutors who refused to file charges, juries who refused to convict, and a federal government that treated civil rights violations as local matters beyond its jurisdiction. Isaac Woodard should have disappeared into the statistics, another victim whose name would be forgotten, whose suffering would change nothing. But something unexpected happened. The story got out. A civil rights organization in New York heard about the case and brought it to the attention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP brought it to the newspapers. And the newspapers, still full of patriotic fervor from the recently concluded war, found in Woodard's story something that challenged the narrative of American righteousness that had sustained the nation through 5 years of global conflict. Orson Welles, the actor and director, heard about Isaac Woodard and dedicated a series of radio broadcasts to the case. His voice carried into millions of American homes, describing in vivid detail what had been done to a soldier who had served his country faithfully. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about Woodard, a mournful ballad that asked how a man could fight for freedom abroad and find none at home. The pressure mounted, and then, unexpectedly, the case reached the desk of a man who had the power to do something about it, President Harry S. Truman. Truman was not a natural ally of civil rights. He was a Midwesterner with Southern sympathies, a product of his time who used racial slurs casually in private correspondence. But he was also a man who believed in the dignity of military service, having served as an artillery officer in World War I. The idea that a soldier could be blinded for asking to use a restroom offended something fundamental in him. More importantly, he was a pragmatic politician who understood that the world had changed. The Soviet Union was pointing to American racism as evidence of capitalist hypocrisy. African nations were gaining independence and watching how America treated its black citizens. The old order was collapsing, and Truman sensed it. In September 1946, he ordered his Attorney General to investigate the Woodard case and to prosecute those responsible under federal civil rights statutes. The trial was held in Columbia, South Carolina. In November 1946, Chief Linwood Shull was charged with violating Isaac Woodard's civil rights under the authority of federal law. It was a risky prosecution. Federal intervention in state criminal matters was rare and controversial, seen by many white Southerners as Northern aggression and federal overreach. The jury was all white, drawn from a community that viewed Shull not as a criminal but as a defender of the social order. The prosecution presented evidence of the beating, medical testimony about Woodard's injuries, and eyewitness accounts of what had happened that night in Batesburg. Isaac Woodard himself testified, led to the witness stand by a family member because he could no longer see. He described the beating in a quiet, steady voice. He explained that he had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. He had simply asked to use a restroom. The defense argued that Shull had acted in self-defense, that Woodard had been drunk and aggressive, that the injuries were accidental. They painted Woodard as a troublemaker who had provoked his own beating, and the jury, after 30 minutes of deliberation, acquitted Linwood Shull on all charges. The courtroom erupted in applause. White spectators cheered. Shull smiled and shook hands with his supporters. Isaac Woodard sat in silence, his ruined eyes covered by dark glasses, his hands folded in his lap. Justice had been done, according to the laws of South Carolina. A white man had been tried by a jury of his peers and found not guilty. The system had worked exactly as it was supposed to work, but something had shifted. The acquittal of Linwood Shull was so transparently unjust, so clearly a mockery of the rule of law, that it could not be ignored or explained away. Newspapers across the country covered the verdict with outrage. The black press, which had been reporting on such injustices for decades, intensified its coverage. But more significantly, white Americans who had never paid much attention to racial violence began to pay attention now. They had just won a war against fascism. They had defeated nations that claimed racial superiority as a governing principle, and now they were confronted with evidence that their own country practiced its own form of racial tyranny, that men who had worn the uniform were not safe in their own land, that the democracy they had fought to defend did not extend to all its citizens. President Truman was furious about the verdict. In private meetings, he expressed his outrage to advisors, but more importantly, he acted. In December 1946, he established the President's Committee on Civil Rights, a panel charged with investigating racial violence and recommending federal action. It was a bold move, one that would cost him political support in the South. But Truman had seen something in the Woodard case that he could not unsee. He had recognized that the problem was not individual bad actors, but a system designed to oppress, and systems, once identified, could be changed. The committee worked for a year, collecting testimony from victims of racial violence, documenting patterns of discrimination, and analyzing the legal structures that made such abuses possible. Their report, released in October 1947, was titled "To Secure These Rights," and it was a damning indictment of American racism. It documented lynchings, police brutality, employment discrimination, and voting restrictions. It recommended sweeping federal action, anti-lynching legislation, desegregation of the armed forces, federal protection of voting rights, and the establishment of a permanent civil rights division in the Department of Justice. The recommendations were radical for their time, far ahead of what most white Americans were willing to accept. But the report had been commissioned by the President, and it could not be easily dismissed. In February 1948, Truman addressed Congress and called for the implementation of the committee's recommendations. It was the first time an American president had asked Congress to pass comprehensive civil rights legislation. The speech was met with fury from Southern Democrats who saw it as a betrayal. Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, the same state where Isaac Woodard had been blinded and Linwood Sewell had been acquitted, led a revolt. He and other Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention later that year and formed the state's Rights Democratic Party, popularly known as the Dixiecrats, running Thurmond as their presidential candidate on a platform of maintaining segregation. The Democratic Party split. Truman's political advisors told him he could not win re-election without the South, but Truman pushed forward anyway. And then on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which mandated the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. It was not immediate. Full integration would take years, but it was irreversible. The military, which had been rigidly segregated throughout World War II, which had treated black soldiers as second-class citizens even as they fought and died for their country, would now be integrated. Black soldiers would serve alongside white soldiers. They would share barracks, mess halls, and combat units. The principle that had justified segregation, that black Americans were inherently inferior, would no longer have the force of federal policy behind it, at least not in the military. The order did not mention Isaac Woodard by name, but everyone understood that it was his story and the stories of thousands of other black veterans who had returned home to violence and discrimination that had made the order necessary. Woodard had paid the price, his sight, his health, his future, but his suffering had not been meaningless. It had exposed the lie at the heart of American democracy, the gap between the nation's stated ideals and its actual practices, and that exposure had made change possible. Isaac Woodard never recovered his sight. He lived the rest of his life in darkness, dependent on family and friends for care. He moved to New York, where the NAACP helped support him. He spoke occasionally at civil rights events, telling his story in that same quiet voice, explaining what had happened to him in Batesburg. But he was not bitter, at least not publicly. He did not call for vengeance. He simply asked that people remember, that they understand what had been done to him and why, and that they work to ensure it never happened again. The civil rights movement that exploded in the 1950s and 1960s, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, was built on the foundation laid by people like Isaac Woodard. The soldiers who had come home from World War II expecting to be treated as equal citizens had instead encountered the same racism they had left behind. But they had also brought with them a new determination, a new refusal to accept the old order. They had fought for democracy abroad. Now they would fight for it at home. And they would not be alone. White Americans, too, had begun to see the contradiction between American ideals and American reality. The Cold War made that contradiction especially painful. How could America claim to lead the free world when it denied freedom to millions of its own citizens? In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing discrimination based on race in employment and public accommodations. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act guaranteed federal protection of black Americans' right to vote. These were victories won through decades of struggle, through boycotts and sit-ins and marches and court cases, and yes, through violence endured. But they were also victories that had their roots in the immediate post-war period, in the moment when black veterans came home and demanded the rights they had earned. Linwood Sewell never expressed remorse for what he did to Isaac Woodard. He returned to his job as police chief and served for several more years before retiring. He was never held accountable under state or federal law. He lived into old age and died peacefully. There is no justice in that. But there is a kind of historical judgment. Sewell is remembered now only for his cruelty, only for the night he blinded a soldier who had done nothing wrong. His name is a byword for the brutality of the Jim Crow South. And Isaac Woodard, the man he tried to break, is remembered as a hero, as a man whose suffering helped change a nation. In 2019, the city of Batesburg-Leesville, South Carolina, the town where Woodard was beaten, officially apologized for what had happened. It was 73 years late. Woodard had been dead for decades. But the apology mattered because it represented an acknowledgement that what had happened was not a personal dispute or a tragic misunderstanding, but a moral atrocity committed by agents of the state. The plaque installed in Woodard's honor reads, in part, "We are profoundly sorry for the pain and suffering inflicted upon Isaac Woodard and all victims of racial violence and injustice. It is a small gesture, but it is also a recognition that history does not forget, that the arc of the moral universe does bend toward justice, even if it bends slowly. The night that changed everything was not the night Isaac Woodard was blinded. It was the accumulation of nights, of stories, of outrages that could no longer be ignored. It was the moment when enough people saw clearly what had always been there, that you could not claim to be a democracy while denying dignity to millions of your citizens, that you could not celebrate freedom while enforcing segregation, that you could not honor your soldiers while blinding them for asking to use a restroom. The night that changed everything was the night America had to look at itself honestly, to see the gap between its ideals and its reality, and to decide what kind of nation it wanted to be. Black soldiers in 1945 faced hate. They faced discrimination, violence, and a system designed to keep them in their place. But they did not accept it. They fought back, not with weapons, but with courage, with dignity, with an insistence that they were human beings deserving of respect. And slowly, painfully, against enormous resistance, America began to listen. The changes that came were not gifts granted by benevolent white leaders. They were rights won through struggle, through sacrifice, through the determination of people like Isaac Woodard who refused to be erased. The war against fascism was won in 1945, but the war for democracy at home was just beginning. And in that longer struggle, the soldiers who came home to face hate were the vanguard. They had seen what America could be when it lived up to its ideals. They had served alongside men from every background fighting for a common cause. And they understood that the segregation they returned to was not natural or inevitable, but a choice, a system maintained by violence and law and custom. And choices could be changed. Isaac Woodard died in 1992 at the age of 73. He had lived almost his entire adult life in darkness, unable to see the changes his suffering had helped bring about. But those changes were real. The military he had served was now integrated. The buses he had ridden were no longer segregated. The laws that had protected Linwood Shule were gone. It was not enough. Racism did not end with the passage of civil rights legislation, but it was progress, it was movement. It was proof that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be challenged and changed. The stories of black soldiers in World War II and the racism they faced when they came home are not footnotes to history. They're central to understanding how America became what it is today. The civil rights movement did not begin in the 1950s. It began the moment the first black veteran came home and refused to accept second-class citizenship. It began with people like Isaac Woodard, who paid a terrible price for demanding their rights. And it continued through decades of struggle, through setbacks and victories, until the legal structures of segregation were finally dismantled. But the work is not finished. The story of Isaac Woodard reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that rights once won can be taken away, that vigilance is necessary. It reminds us that individual acts of cruelty are enabled by systems of oppression, and that changing those systems requires not just good intentions but concrete action. Legal reform and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. It reminds us that heroes are not always the ones who fire the guns or storm the beaches. Sometimes they are the ones who endure, who survive, who tell their stories so that others can learn from them. The night that changed everything was not a single night but a series of moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices. When Isaac Woodard boarded that bus in his uniform believing that his service entitled him to dignity. When civil rights activists heard his story and refused to let it be forgotten. When Orson Welles used his platform to tell millions of Americans what had happened. When Harry Truman, a man of his time with all the prejudices of his generation, looked at the Woodard case and understood that something fundamental had to change. When black veterans across the South organized and protested and demanded their rights. When white Americans slowly and reluctantly began to see that the nation's claim to moral leadership rang hollow as long as it tolerated such injustice at home. These moments accumulated, they built on each other, and they created a movement that transformed America. Not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. The country Isaac Woodard returned to in 1946 was not the country he died in 1992. Laws had changed. Attitudes had shifted. The open, brutal racism that had been a fact of daily life had been pushed to the margins, forced underground, made socially unacceptable in most contexts. That did not mean racism had disappeared. Systemic inequalities persisted. New forms of discrimination emerged, but it meant that the battle was not hopeless, that change was possible. And that is what the story of Isaac Woodard ultimately teaches us, that history is made by human choices, that injustice thrives on silence and indifference, and that speaking out, even when it seems futile, even when the system is stacked against you, can plant seeds that eventually bear fruit. Woodard did not set out to be a civil rights icon. He simply wanted to use a restroom. But his refusal to be invisible, his willingness to testify despite his blindness, his insistence that what happened to him mattered, these acts of quiet courage rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated. Today, there are young men and women serving in the United States military who will never know segregation in the ranks, who will never be told they cannot eat in the same mess hall as their white comrades, who will be judged by their competence and courage rather than the color of their skin. That is Isaac Woodard's legacy. It is the legacy of every black soldier who served in World War II and came home to face hatred and discrimination. They fought 2 wars, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home. The first war ended in 1945. The second war continues. But because of what they endured, because of what they sacrificed, the ground has shifted. The fight is not over, but it is not hopeless either. The night that changed everything was the night America had to confront what it had become and to choose what it wanted to be. That choice is never final. Every generation must make it anew. But the example of people like Isaac Woodard, their courage, their dignity, their refusal to accept injustice lights the way forward. They remind us that change is possible, that ordinary people can challenge extraordinary evil, and that the work of building a just society is never finished but always worth doing. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of Black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. Their sacrifices must not be forgotten, and their legacy continues to inspire the fight for justice and equality today.